This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. The show begins with the cattle market update from Tyler Cozzens, director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, as he reviews the cattle on feed report and the impact of New World screwworm and drought. K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner continues today's show as he talks about management steps cattle producers could be taking this time of year for spring and fall calving herds. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, ends the show as he reminds people why it is important to leave wildlife wild and what to do if you do encounter wildlife. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Tyler, what information are you seeing from the June cattle on feed report?
In general, the report could be viewed as mixed due to the slightly higher cattle on feed, but also slightly bearish as placements and marketings were lower than a year ago. So looking a little bit closer at the report, industry analysts were actually surveyed ahead of the report, and they were expecting cattle on feed as of June 1st to be up about 2.5% from last year. So with the analysts' expectations, they actually ranged from about up 1.7% to up 3.8% from last year. Now, the report noted that actual cattle on feed were up 2.1% from last year to 11.7 million head, which was just below the average estimate, but it was still within the range of expectations. So it is not a big surprise, but it is noteworthy given that overall supplies remain tight across the U.S. And seasonally, we would expect cattle on feed numbers to actually trend slightly lower during this summer months. So a little bit of a different trend there. Cattle placements and cattle marketings in May is where the report was most interesting. USDA reported cattle marketings in May down about 207,000 head, or that was down about 12% from last year to 1.55 million head. Analysts were actually expecting a decline in marketings of about 11% on average for the month of May. The actual May cattle marketings down 12% was at the low end of the range of estimates. The 12% decline in marketings for May was somewhat of a surprise given May had the same number of slaughter days than last year. But the lower marketings also highlights just how tight cattle supplies are in the U.S. and also shows a measured approach from the packers on the pace of cattle marketings through the supply chain to meet consumer beef demand. Now, looking at cattle placements, USDA reported that cattle placements into feedlots during the month of May were actually down about 183,000 head, or about 10% from a year ago to 1.7 million head. This was on the low end of analyst pre-report estimates, which were expecting a decline of about 6% on average. The decline in placements was not unexpected, but actual placements coming in on the lower end of expectations only highlights just how tight supplies are and that the pace of calves moving off of pasture and into feedlots may have slowed in May, which is not completely unexpected during the summer months. Now, looking ahead into June, weekly cattle receipts will be an item to watch as an indication of how many feeders may be moving off of pasture and into feedlots. Now, as we look at a little bit deeper into the cattle placement numbers during the month of May, USDA breaks out cattle placements data by weight category. Now, USDA reported that placements of calves weighing less than 600 pounds in May were 320,000 head, which was down about 15,000 head or 5% from last year. May placement of calves weighing 600 to 700 pounds were down 35,000 head or 13% from last year to 240,000 head. Placement of calves weighing 700 to 800 pounds were reported at 400,000 head in total, which was down 50,000 head or 11% from last year. Placement of calves in May that weighed over 800 pounds declined 83,000 head or 10% from last year to 744,000 head. So overall, the decline in placements across the weight categories was not unexpected, but it is an item to watch as drought pressure across cattle country could impact range of pasture conditions and limit feed availability. And this could lead to producers placing calves sooner than expected and also at lighter weights. Now, looking a little bit more deeper into some of the statistics and the data from the cattle on feed report, one of those statistics that we look at and that we calculate to keep an eye on is the number of cattle on feed over 150 days. Now, this gives us an idea of the overall pace of cattle moving through the feedlots and eventually into slaughter facilities. So it's a gauge for the number of head of cattle to be slaughtered in the coming weeks and months, but it's also a gauge for what we should expect for cattle dress weights. So cattle on feed over 150 days was 3.5 million head as of June 1, which was an increase of more than 340,000 head or 11% from last year. This was not unexpected, as the trend of cattle staying on feed for a longer period of time has been occurring for the better part of 2 years now. Since the start of the year to mid-June, weekly steer dress weights have ranged from a low of 973 pounds to a high of 989 pounds, with an average of 982 pounds. During the same period last year through mid-June, weekly steer dress weights ranged from 938 to 962 pounds, with an average of 948 pounds. So on average, year-over-year comparison for steer dress weights is an increase of about 34 pounds or 4%. The trend of higher dress weights has been occurring for more than 2 years now and highlights the efficiency gains in the cattle feeding sector to meet the consumer demand for domestic beef.
And thinking about our cattle market, what are we seeing for fed cattle?
Sure. So kind of looking a little bit more at some of the market conditions here. Weekly fed steer prices, so this would be that 5-area fed steer price, continues to chart a similar seasonal trend to last year, with prices moving generally higher since the start of the year and tracking well above year-ago levels. Now, fed steer prices started the year close to $230 per hundredweight and reached a $262.85 per hundredweight in mid-May. But more recently, prices have actually been tracking in the mid-$250 per hundredweight area. Now, compared to a year ago on average, weekly fed steer prices through mid-June have been tracking about $35 per hundredweight or 16% above the prior year. Now, last year, fed steer prices did not reach a peak until August, when prices reached a peak of $244.25 per hundredweight. If this follows a similar trend to 2025, the peak fed steer price will probably occur in the third quarter of this year. Now, kind of tying all some of this discussion together as well, it's good to look at the box beef cutout value, right? Because seasonally here, we're moving through the summer months, and we typically see some of our peaks occur in box beef value around these holiday seasons of Memorial Day, July 4th, and Labor Day. Last year, we saw peaks occur around July 4th and Labor Day. This year, we're watching the trend of the box beef cutout value to see if we're going to see another one of those peak values around July 4th. So far, box beef cutout value has been trending slightly higher. We haven't quite seen as much of an upward movement as we did last year. The box beef cutout value last week was just below $4. It was just at $3.96 per hundredweight. Now, the tricky thing is looking at some of those primal values. What we're actually seeing is a little bit more of a muted tone on some of these primal values, especially the rib, the loin, and the brisket. We're seeing the chuck kind of track a little bit sideways, but kind of looking at the round and the flank. The round, we're seeing a little bit more of a sideways movement, and the flank, we're seeing actually some strength there, right? So some of this is kind of tied to what consumers are looking for as far as the grilling season goes. And one of those stronger ones has actually been the ground beef side of things, because we're actually seeing ground beef prices at the retail level just topping $7 per pound, which is record levels there. And so looking at consumer demand moving forward will be one of those things that we will be tracking quite closely to see if this box beef cutout value can hold some strength here through the summer months and trend a little bit higher before it moves lower kind of during that third quarter and into the fourth quarter.
And while we're talking about the cattle market, an important factor to continue to take into consideration, New World screwworm, and what update do you have on that?
So kind of a more recent update with as far as New World screwworm goes. With the reported cases of New World screwworm a few weeks ago, the cattle sector is keeping a close eye on reported cases. Now, USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, has a dedicated website to report cases. It is screwworm.gov. Now, giving a recap as far as reported cases on USDA APHIS's website, at the end of last week, APHIS was reporting 12 total animal cases. Kind of looking at those reported cases, there were 8 cases reported in cattle. All of these cases are in Texas, in the counties of Zavala, LaSalle, Edwards, and Tom Green counties. There was one reported case in sheep in Sutton County, Texas. There were 2 cases reported in goats, one in Gillespie County, Texas, and one in Edwards County, Texas. And then there was 1 case reported in a dog in Lee County, New Mexico. Now, on the USDA APHIS website, they note that 9 of the 12 cases that were reported are considered to be active, with the remaining 3 of 12 cases to be inactive. The 3 inactive cases, that would be the case in sheep in Sutton County, Texas, a case in cattle in Zavala County, Texas, and a case in dog in Lee County, New Mexico. Another quick side note, USDA announced that last week that they have a combined total of $105 million in funding that they've allocated to fight New World screwworm. These funds are aimed to sharpen detection, accelerate control and eradication tools, and strengthen rapid response capabilities. Good to keep in mind that New World screwworm it's a fluid situation, but it is also good to keep an eye on the reported cases, especially where the cases are being detected, as this will be a gauge into any potential further spread of the pest and any potential impacts to domestic livestock, and also keeping an eye on cases in the wildlife populations as well.
And thinking of another factor impacting the cattle market right now, drought, and what are you seeing for its impact?
Sure. Drought is one of those things that we kind of have to keep in mind, especially across cattle country. And drought this year has definitely been a pretty large factor, especially in kind of the central plains and western U.S. as it continues to persist across those parts of the region. USDA's drought monitor map is actually reporting about 55% of the country is rated D1 to D4 or moderate to exceptional drought for mid-June. So compared to the same week a year ago, the drought monitor was actually reporting just over 30% of the country was rated in that D1 to D4 or moderate to exceptional drought category. Now, across cattle country, USDA is reporting that approximately 53% of the cattle inventory is being impacted by drought. So a fair amount of impact there from just an inventory standpoint. This is actually an improvement from prior weeks where USDA was actually reporting over 60% of the cattle inventory in drought areas. Now, drought continues to cover a large portion of the western U.S. and central plains, as I had mentioned. This is raising concerns regarding feed availability and also just the prospects for rebuilding the herd, as just a limited feed availability makes producers have to make some adjustments as far as just production decisions moving forward.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with June management reminders for cattle producers with K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome, Shelby. Appreciate it, as always.
Jason, for this time of year, what might spring calving cattle producers want to be checking out in their breeding pastures?
I think, of course, this is a really busy time of the year for all of our producers as folks are working through a lot of activities on the farm and ranch this time of year. I think really for our spring calving cow herds, a couple of things that we really want to focus on now, for folks, if they've already started the breeding season and turned bulls in with those cows, or if they're getting ready to do so here pretty soon. I think really one of the things we want to focus on is make sure that folks are doing a good job of paying attention to those bulls here at the start of the breeding season, making sure that they are actively getting out there across the pasture and across the cow herd and covering those females. Really, when we come back and we look at it, open females at the end of the breeding season, regardless of how that might happen, that's really costly, certainly from an economic standpoint. And when we think about just the overall cow-calf management picture, that's really the most important thing that we've got to make sure that we get done here now at the start of the breeding season for next year's calf crop. So really paying close attention to making sure that we don't have any injury, that those bulls are staying sound, that they're doing a good job of covering those females is really critical. One of the things that I think is valuable for producers, is to not just necessarily when they're out there checking pastures, checking cows, observing and making sure that those bulls are doing a good job of covering those females and that those females are cycling, but making a note of it, right? Just taking one step further and getting a record made of when you observed a female that was cycling and when you observed a female bred. And then that way, if you've got that, you can go back and you can look at that later on. And if we have a group of open females at the end of the breeding season, or if that female's pregnant, but you can come back and look at her expected calving date later on, that is a really good thing to do, right? Is just have a record of that. And that helps us be able to manage through those situations a lot better as we get later on into the summer and on into the fall. If you've got multiple bulls in a breeding pasture, just making sure that, especially if they're mixed age bulls, you're paying close attention to those yearling bulls and we don't have problems with injury. And if you do find an injured bull, that you're able to respond quickly and get that bull checked out and see what you need to do. And if we need to bring in a replacement bull, you've got time to do that. And so just making sure that you really pay close attention to those things now is really critical. And also too, I think if you're a producer that will restrict the length of your breeding season, if you pull those bulls from those cows and you restrict the length of the breeding season to manage the length of your subsequent calving season, getting those dates on the calendar now, if you don't already have that done, is a good time to do that so you don't forget about that later on here this summer.
Could producers this time of year also be thinking about or scheduling early preg checking?
Absolutely. That's a really good management strategy that I encourage folks to be thinking about doing, particularly in areas where if we're more impacted by drought and forage availability is a question for us. Early pregnancy diagnosis is a great management tool, particularly with replacement heifers where we can identify those pregnancies earlier and we can make management decisions if we're going to keep those females back into the herd or if we're going to move those females on. And there's of course a number of practicing veterinarians that can offer that as a service. If you have the ability to do it yourself, that certainly works very well also. But it's a good management practice that allows us to identify those pregnancies early, of course, and skilled technicians can identify a pregnant animal accurate out at about day 30, right around day 30. And certainly, somewhere between day 30 to day 45 is really kind of a good time to go ahead and get that done. And so again, it's a good activity. I encourage folks to think about that, particularly on their replacement heifers if they haven't been routinely making that part of their management plan. And again, in those areas where we're more concerned about forage availability, and if we need to move those females or think about an alternative marketing plan for those females, if we identify that they're open earlier on, it gives us a little more flexibility on when we can do that. And but certainly we want to get that scheduled out well in advance. And so if you can try to schedule that probably in a month in advance or so of when you might want to do that, that's just good from a planning standpoint. So it's another good practice that I encourage folks to think about.
And while that's more for spring calving cattle herds this time of year, what might fall calving cattle herds need to be thinking about?
That's a really good question, and it's one of those things where here it is, it's the middle of June, and fall might feel like a really long ways off, and to some extent it is, but the context of this discussion is important because we know that if we're kind of an early fall calving program or herd, maybe we might start calving maybe the middle of August or the tail end of August. And that would mean that we're already in that third trimester. And in some situations, we're maybe within the last couple of months of when those females are going to start calving, which means that we're entering that critical time period that's really important for many different reasons when we think about making sure that female has sufficient protein and energy, that we've got good, appropriate calf growth in utero, that female has an opportunity to build adequate colostrum stores as she gets closer to calving. And then also too, thinking about just where that female is from a weight and a condition score standpoint is really important. One of the things that's typically a nice advantage for most fall calving programs or late summer calving programs is that they have the benefit of taking advantage of, in most situations, good forage production and good forage quality at the early part or at the beginning of the grazing season through April, May, and June. And so in most situations, unless we're in an area where we've been impacted by low forage availability, weight and body condition score is usually on our side in those cows with regards to going into the start of the calving season. And so it's usually easy for us to have those females at a body condition score 5 or 6 going into the start of the calving season. But now is a good time to be really assessing where those females are. And if those females are in a situation where we need to increase their plan of nutrition, we need to increase their energy level to add some weight and some condition to them, now is a good time for us to be thinking about doing that because we've got a couple of months here before we get into the calving season where we can do that, and we can do that more cost effectively and do that with a smaller rate of supplementation over a longer period of time. Again, it depends on what product that you might want to use, what feed resources that you have. But now's a good time to certainly be thinking about that. And also, too, I think it's a good opportunity to be rethinking and just looking at what your calf health protocols are for your fall calving herds or for your late summer calving herds as you work through the summer.
What recommendations do you have for cattle producers as they are looking through their inventory of forage and what feedstuffs they have on hand?
So one thing that we certainly see this year here in 2026 is a lot of variation around the state with regards to moisture and forage production so far here this growing season. And I think that's typical in most years as we look at it around the state of Kansas, but it's maybe a little bit more magnified this year where we've got, some areas in the farther central and western areas of the state where we haven't received that moisture that we would like to receive, and we're dealing with some drier conditions. And then on the other end of the state, on the eastern side of the state, folks have experienced some higher rainfall amounts, and we've seen quite a bit of forage production here to start the season off. But I think it's really good to be thinking about going back and looking at what your forage inventory carryover is that you're coming out of the spring feeding season with. It's always good to be going back and getting a good accurate inventory of your bale counts, calculating how much tonnage of silage you think that you have left over from the previous feeding season is a good thing to do. Even if forage production is good, and if you've received a good amount of rainfall right in your area, one thing that I think is important to note is that you look at it more broadly across the U.S. There's a lot of areas right around Kansas, really in three different directions that are dealing with some drought conditions, with some dry conditions. And we know that more broadly, that certainly can place some demands on the forage market when we think about hay prices and where there might be a need for feed resources as we go through the summer. So just because moisture is abundant in your area and you're not in a drought scenario doesn't mean that there may not be a demand for that forage somewhere else. And so be thinking about what your inventory is. If you're in a situation where you think early calf weaning might be a management strategy that you want to approach and do this year in 2026, now's a good time to be looking at your inventory of the feedstuffs that you have on hand, looking at your program and thinking about how you can put together a good quality diet for those calves if you're going to manage those calves after weaning and grow them and develop them, and be thinking about what your plan there is going to be, what feedstuffs might you need to bring in, and how you might be looking to put those diets and those supplementation programs together. So now's just a good time to kind of be going back and assessing those things, again, for a myriad of reasons, and it's always good to be thinking about those activities for this year.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Shelby, appreciate it. Thank you.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Varner. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with a wildlife update from K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, for this time of year, what's an important factor to keep in mind when it comes to wildlife?
This is a good time of the year just to remind folks that when we come across wildlife, it's really best to just let them be wild. This time of the year, we've got fawns that have been recently born. Their defense mechanism is actually just to hold really still. When a predator comes by, they're going to hide. They're going to try and hide down in the grass or whatever kind of cover there is. And so when we come across them, it can seem like there's this abandoned or orphan fawn there, but really mom is probably close by. And so leaving those fawns alone is really the best thing that we can do for their welfare. The same is really true if we come across a nest of cottontail rabbits, baby cottontails. Sometimes we disturb those nests when we're mowing. Sometimes pets come across them and those sorts of things. And those cottontail rabbits are really, really hard to tame. It's hard to keep them alive in captivity. And so when we come across those sorts of things, really just leaving them alone and allowing them to remain wild. Sometimes they do die, but leaving them out there is really the best chance that they have to live.
Any concerns about people coming across wildlife and there maybe being a protective parent around?
Well, that doesn't happen very often, but it is a possibility. Every once in a while, it's possible that you may come across a fawn or something like that, and there could be a doe around that might see you as a threat and, charge at you or something like that. But that would be a pretty rare occurrence. Probably more common situation that might fit with that would be if we were walking a dog and we ended up near a coyote family, some adult coyotes with pups around. We would be seen, and especially our dog would be seen as an intruder in that situation, and the coyotes might act aggressively towards the dog to try and protect their pups.
What should someone do if their dog does bring back wildlife to them?
If it's a situation where your dog brings you something and that animal is visibly injured, then, reach out to Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. You could do an internet search for wildlife rehabilitators near me, and there is a list of folks who are licensed wildlife rehabilitators. They would actually have the legal authority to possess those wildlife and try and nurse them back to health. If the animal is healthy, then my suggestion would be that you just get that animal away from the dog if you can do that safely. If it's a young raccoon that could bite you, that's a challenging situation, and we don't want to expose ourselves to disease risk or something like that. If it's a very young critter like a raccoon, if you wore welding gloves, really heavy duty leather gloves with lots of padding in them, you could probably get that raccoon away from the dog and put it back outside, and then the adults may find it. But really, we really need to be careful in those sorts of situations that we don't expose ourselves to getting bitten or clawed or something like that, because then we might have to go to the doctor and go through a rabies exposure protocol and go through that whole ordeal. So that's not a good situation if we can avoid it.
And you made a comment about sometimes wildlife being wild is having dead wildlife. And if someone comes across that, just let it be.
Yeah. Unless, if you find a dead wild animal in, let's say, in your garage or in your barn or something like that, and we do need to remove it, then really the best case scenario would be that we would get a shovel underneath of it. If you have nitrile gloves or even like dishwashing gloves or something like that you could put on your hands to protect you from any germs that might be associated with it. If you do have to handle it, that's good. If we do need to move them, if you live in the country, of course, you could just take that animal outside, move it away from the building or the yard, put it in a place where it can decompose or be food for other critters, and it's not going to bother us. If you live in town, then really double bagging that critter in trash bags and then putting it in the household trash would be the best thing to do.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.